YouTube is filled with hot takes on how the war in Ukraine is going and how Russia's responding to it. But the real question is, what do Russia's military leadership and defense think tanks actually think about the conflict and how it's going? Today, we're going to bring you the honey straight from the hive, with opinion pieces and battlefield observations from both Russian think tanks and leadership. Right off the bat, it's important to understand how Russia fundamentally sees this war. The Putin line has been that this is a special military operation to secure the safety of Russian-speaking people in the east of Ukraine and topple a Nazi government in Kyiv. That might sound ridiculous to us in the West, but it pulls incredibly well inside Russia itself and disturbingly across large swaths of Africa and even the Middle East. Nobody is really thinking about the war in these terms, however, and the Putin regime has at least dropped the toppling a Nazi regime in Kyiv line, which, given Zelensky's Jewish ancestry, is about as ridiculous as it comes. Instead, Russia firmly views the current war as a proxy war between itself and the West. And for once, Russia is actually not wrong. The West has repeatedly stated it has no wish to militarily confront Russia or escalate the conflict, but the truth of the matter is that, like the Soviet Union in Vietnam, the West is exploiting the war to directly weaken Russia as much as possible. Support for Ukraine has been called the greatest investment the United States and its allies have ever made by numerous defense analysts. In exchange for several $billion, most of which is spent on the acquisition cost of hardware, not actual money being sent directly to Ukraine, the unified West is weakening one of two remaining competitors to the current liberal world order. Adding even more bang for the buck, Russia is an overtly hostile nuclear power, and eroding the capabilities of a hostile nuclear power is always in the best interests of anyone who doesn't like dictators with nukes. Even if Russia pulled out of the war tomorrow, it has in effect been shattered and would pose no conventional military threat to the rest of Europe any longer. However, recent events have shaped Russian perceptions of this proxy war. It's difficult to separate propaganda from honest opinions in open-source Russian publications, given that any negative opinion on the state of the conflict could be used for prosecution under new laws meant to keep the truth suppressed. Even so, there's a growing trend amongst Russian commentators referring to the conflict as a failing proxy war for the West, not because Ukraine isn't achieving considerable battlefield successes, but because of what many see as Ukraine fatigue settling in amongst the nation's supporters. With American Republicans blocking further Ukraine aid in the latest budget proposal, the message is clear. If Russia continues fighting, even if it's actively losing, eventually the West will give up and end their support. Without direct aid from the US and its partners, Ukraine has no chance, and Russia will inevitably win the war of attrition. Unfortunately, signals like the US Republicans threatening to cut off funding is making Ukraine take increasingly desperate risks to prove its worth. Currently, the nation is openly planning a major amphibious operation against Crimea, a move which, even if successful, and that's incredibly unlikely, will cost Ukraine dearly in terms of lives and equipment. There is currently almost zero strategic benefit to such an operation, and yet Ukraine is feeling pressured to present a big win or else lose its Western support. Already, immediately following the Republican blocking of further aid, Ukraine has launched multiple special forces raids into the Crimean coast in scouting and show the flag operations with little to no strategic value. Ukrainian operators have been killed and captured in these raids, leading to a senseless loss of life and potential security leaks from interrogation of captured POWs. Given the extent to which Russia has used torture against Ukrainian POWs before, that's a very credible risk. Russian confidence that the West will lose the will to continue to fight is so high that it's resorting to pure attritional war in order to slow down the Ukrainian counteroffensive. In recently made available after-action reports and battlefield observations, it was revealed that Russia was purposefully sacrificing its tanks in order to inflict proportionally greater losses on the Ukrainians, despite knowing its tanks would not survive the engagement. This isn't a tactic of desperation, but of a nation who knows it has greater military mass than its opponent, and simply has to run out the clock. By framing the war as a proxy conflict for the survival of the nation, Russia has apparently found great success in motivating soldiers into those suicide tactics, or they simply lack any other choice, given the widely reported use of blocking forces with orders to kill anyone who retreats. Russian think tanks also observe how Western media is reporting on the conflict. They correctly note that in the West, the ongoing war is framed not in terms of Ukraine's successes and Russia's failures, as in the first year of the conflict, but rather in terms of Ukraine's offensive failures and Russia's defensive successes. The Russians view this as proof that their commitment to fighting the long war until the West tires is working, and that the West has no backbone for a prolonged conflict. Sadly, they may not be mistaken. Western reporting has often reported on the strength of Russia's defenses, which are formidable, while ignoring that shortly after the current offensive started, Ukraine had completely switched tactics and goals. Rather than achieve the massive breakthrough they'd initially hoped for, and still might get in Zaporizhia, Ukraine focused on breaking Russia's ability to fight a prolonged conflict by targeting supplies, command and control nodes, and more importantly, artillery. This is attested to by the widely reported case of Russian General Ivan Popov, who was fired for openly complaining about Ukrainian successes in conducting counter-battery fire, the staggering casualties artillery forces were taking, and the lack of Russian counter-battery capabilities have been wreaking havoc on the Russian side. Popov made the mistake of speaking the truth, and that cost him dearly. But while Ukraine's shift was evident to him, it's not been as obvious to the Western media apparatus, which continues to frame the offensive in the old terms. Seen from the new strategic goals Ukraine has set for itself, the offensive is a wild success, significantly attriting Russian artillery forces, forcing the retreat of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, and putting vital Russian lines of communication in serious jeopardy. Either Russian sources are also viewing the current offensive incorrectly, or honest opinions are too dangerous to publish, because we find that they too are touting the failure of the Ukrainian offensive. Despite taking a 3-to-1 casualty ratio on the defensive, Russia continues to tout the failure of the offensive, seeing as proof that its attrition campaign is working. Interestingly, many inside Russia now believe that a ceasefire is inevitable, despite there being no signal whatsoever from the Ukrainian side or even its partners that such a prospect is even on the table. Interestingly, we've seen the significant downplaying of Russian failures during the war. Rather than the type of honest review and critique that Western militaries and governments rely on, Russian outlets and senior leadership instead try to paint the conflict as one where both sides are making strategic missteps. While Ukraine has made blunders, they absolutely pale in comparison to the utter incompetence of the Russian military. The embarrassing defeat at Kyiv is still painted as a goodwill withdrawal of Russian forces, rather than the absolute rout that it was. And here it's often difficult to know if the commentator actually believes this or simply towing the propaganda line. There is at least an admission that the first mobilization was a disaster, though there's no evidence that should Putin push for a second major mobilization, it could actually avoid the mistakes of the first, given that Russia still lacks the proper resources and its military structure is fundamentally weak and corrupt. For Russian observers, despite the ongoing losses, victory is seen as inevitable due to one single reason: mass. While some don't deny Ukraine's successes, they play up the fact that the Russian military is simply much bigger than the Ukrainian military. In fact, most believe that for Ukraine to win, it has to reach an impossible number of troops, weapons, and equipment, as much as 3 times as much ammunition, double the number of troops, and hundreds of modern combat aircraft as they have now. They observe that such a buildup would take several months at minimum, giving Russia ample time to respond. Second, they posit the West is simply unwilling to commit to such military aid. In the first case, Russia has shown zero ability to actually respond to Ukraine's preparations and military buildup. The flow of Western equipment into Ukraine in anticipation of a spring offensive was in no way interdicted or even harassed by the Russians. While at its most vulnerable, there wasn't a single military strike or act of sabotage against long convoys of American Bradley and European Leopard tanks. To believe that Russia would have ample time to disrupt a significant Ukrainian military buildup is simply put utter fantasy. There have indeed been high-profile cases of Russian strikes against Ukrainian supply convoys, but these all occurred relatively close to the active front. Russia has almost no ability to conduct the type of ISR operations required to strike at Western equipment before it approaches the front, at which point it's typically too late. In fact, American observers have noted that Russia's ability to conduct simple post-strike damage assessments can take as much as 2 days, showing that Russia's ISR capabilities are woefully inadequate. On the second point, here Russian observers may be right. Germany had to be almost literally forced to allowing the export of Leopard tanks, and collectively the entire West refused to send tanks until almost the very last moment before the spring offensive was slated to begin. It's been the same story with combat aircraft like the F-16 and the ATACMS or other long-range precision weapons, as Germany is still refusing to budge on sending its own missiles. The simple fact is, there isn't a lack of will to support Ukraine, but there's a general discomfort with Western nations being painted as aggressors or making Russia lose too much too quickly. All this is doing is emboldening Russia to continue the conflict and costing Ukrainian military and civilian lives. While the West hems and haws over if sending a single tank will cause Putin to nuke the world, the International Criminal Court has found evidence that Russia continues to wage a campaign of terror on Ukrainian civilians and POWs behind the front lines. There's a critical and fundamental mistake in Russian thinking, however, when commenting on how much hardware Ukraine actually needs to score decisive victories. And this is an institutional flaw of the very way Russia thinks about modern military conflict. Despite suffering the bite of only a handful of precision weapons in Ukraine's hands, Russia still significantly underestimates the efficiency of the Western way of war and the force multiplier that Western weapons truly bring versus their Russian counterparts. The ability to rapidly strike with pinpoint precision can have significantly more battlefield effect than a battalion of new tanks. The United States has proven this twice, once in Desert Storm and again in the second invasion of Iraq, when the US invaded with so few troops that many in the Defense Department feared it would lead to catastrophe. However, even they underestimated the sheer dominance of Western weapon systems and ways of war. Ukraine does not need mass to rival Russia in order to achieve victory, but it does need modern Western weapons in quantity to do so. With an estimated 2 to 3 dozen HIMARS, Ukraine has completely canceled Russia's ability to conduct large offensives and significantly reduced Russian artillery superiority by destroying its storage depots. While at the start of the war, Russia was lobbing hundreds of thousands of shells a day, the introduction of even only a handful of HIMARS into the conflict forced Russia to break up its massive ammunition depots into many smaller ones and pull them way back from the front. This slowed the pace of the Russian artillery and gave Ukrainian forces much-needed breathing room. Absolutely no Russian weapon can compare to the impact that only a handful of American HIMARS have had on the conflict. Russian belief that Ukraine needs more aid than the West is capable or willing to provide, out of fear of weakening themselves too much, is simply incorrect, and proof that the Russian military thinking has yet to join the 21st century, or even the latter part of the 20th. The West can provide, quite easily, sufficient mass for Ukraine to win a decisive victory. About the only part where the Russians are right is that the West is simply not wanting to. But not because it would fundamentally weaken itself, but simply because the West continues to suffer from the fear of being perceived as the aggressors on the world stage, or of even escalating the conflict to a completely irrational nuclear exchange. There is at least acknowledgement that Russia's biggest strength in the war at this moment is the vast fortifications it built last winter. The results speak for themselves, though, as the lines in Zaporizhia begin to crumble. The folly of believing a massive defensive network could be a war-winning strategy will likely be made clear. Even so, Russia's very formidable defenses have bought the nation time and the ability to portray the war domestically as one where maybe Russia isn't outright winning, but Ukraine is surely failing. This is important as many believe Putin will be forced to enact another round of mobilization. Another surprising acknowledgement from within Russia is the sober realization that the nation simply lacks the strategic advantage needed to secure victory on the offensive against Ukraine. This is actually bad news for Ukraine, as it's likely that Russia is at last sober-minded enough to understand it cannot afford to launch costly offensives against a superior, motivated, trained, and equipped Ukrainian force. Last year, Russia did all it could to hasten its own defeat by repeatedly launching catastrophic attacks that achieved little strategic gain. It's thus likely that despite expectations from within Russia that the military command will order a massive offensive, such an order won't come. Instead, it seems that Russian strategic thinking is shifting toward a defensive posture. For Russia, the key to victory lies in ensuring that Ukraine cannot split Russian forces in half via penetration attacks toward the Sea of Azov. Rather, all they have to do is simply exhaust Western goodwill toward Ukraine. In the former, Russia is keenly aware that Ukraine is attempting to split Russian forces in half in Zaporizhia. To prevent this, it sacrificed some of its most elite units, including vaunted paratrooper forces who have by all accounts been very successful on the defense, but are still suffering terrible losses. The slowdown of the Ukrainian penetration in the region of Tokmak is attributed by both sides to the emergency deployment of elite paratrooper forces. Those same forces, however, now face encirclement and annihilation, as reported by many Russian war journalists and bloggers with a direct link to personnel within said units. Many are increasingly seeing the Russian theory of victory as simply exhausting NATO support for Ukraine. There's hope that the winter season will see an end to the current Ukrainian offensive, despite Ukrainian commanders vowing they will not repeat the mistake of last year, even if winter fighting is inevitably going to be more costly. Disturbingly, Russian observers make a prediction that is likely to be accurate. While they see the war as won in terms of either a decisive victory or defeat, they believe that the West instead sees the war as a means to contain and isolate Russia, and thus do not share the same will to continue the conflict as Russia does. This may not be entirely incorrect, given the West's hesitance to rally truly war-winning levels of military aid to Ukraine. In the words of one Russian think tank, it seems that the West does not really want an escalation, but rather a classic Cold War and multi-year containment, a long strategy that has already proved effective once. To their credit, there is a sober acknowledgement that the US's containment of the Soviet Union was very successful in fundamentally weakening the nation and causing it to fall apart. However, predictions that the West is only looking for containment and not victory may or may not be accurate. Truthfully, it's difficult to gauge exactly what the West wants from this war, and many within NATO have commented that the organization lacks any real strategy for a Ukrainian victory. The Russian theory of victory thus posits weakening NATO support and either winning a long war of attrition or scoring a decisive military defeat on Ukraine once Western support has dwindled or run dry. While there's little belief left within Russia that the entire nation of Ukraine can be brought into the fold, it's still perfectly plausible for them that Russia will be able to hold on to the annexed territories. Meanwhile, they believe all it'll take for the war to end favorably for Russia is for the Russian military to begin to score decisive defeats on Ukrainian forces. At this point, it's believed the West will sue for negotiations, while the Ukrainian military is still in a position of relative strength. There's no faith inside Russia that if the UAF suffered a major setback, Western support would continue, and again, they might not be wrong about that. The West, it seems, is fundamentally blind to the nature of war, and the fact that Ukraine can suffer multiple major defeats and still have the means to continue successfully prosecuting the conflict. This might be due to the fact that the West has been, to put it frankly, spoiled by its military successes in conventional war. No Western army has suffered a major defeat since the Korean War. Even in Vietnam, the US was forced to retreat due to a lack of political will to continue fighting. The United States military won every single engagement it entered against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. Thus, it's probable the Western observers have been spoiled by success and could be defeat shy. A major battlefield defeat for Ukraine could signal to them a fundamental weakness, when in reality this is simply the nature of conventional war when waged by two powers who closely match each other. The Russians may be right to believe that all they need to win the war on favorable terms is to score a few major defeats on Ukraine, enough to scare the West away. Matter of fact, most Russian think tanks seem confident in this, and sadly we can't disagree with them. Now check out how Ukraine humiliated the Russian Navy, or click this other video instead.